Good evening, friends. Today I shall be talking on Coleridge's Kubla Khan. Well, it will be a very brief discussion, and I shall like to have your feedback. If you really like this discussion, we may, in some subsequent lectures, once again take up Kubla Khan from different other aspects. For the present, what we shall do about Kubla Khan is to pose a few questions. I'll be asking a few questions to myself and to yourselves, and I shall try to find out some answers to them. The Kubla Khan, as you all know, is a very well-known poem by Coleridge, which was written in 1797 and was left unpublished after long 19 years at the insistence of Lord Byron. Coleridge had agreed to publish this poem, and during its publication he added to it a long note. And in a way we can say that this long, this detailed, this elaborate note was the cause of many controversies. As Professor Humphrey House has suggested, that had there been no note tagged to the poem, perhaps some of the controversies, some of the questions, some of the confusions would not have cropped up at all. Coleridge's Kubla Khan is a poem composed in dream. Kubla Khan is an unfinished poem. It is a fragment. Now, these are the two very common epithets that are added to the poem, that it is a dream poem and that it is a fragment. Now, very interestingly, these two epithets were used by the poet himself, and as the subtitle of the poem we have these two epithets. You can see here, Kubla Khan, or a vision in a dream, a fragment. So the poet himself says that it is a dream, a vision in a dream, and that it is a fragment. And if we summarize the elaborate note, we shall see that Coleridge points out that this poem was written, or rather this poem was composed by him in a dream. While he was convalescing from his fever and he was under the influence of an anodyne, he dreamt that he had been composing a poem, and he composed about 300 to 400 lines. He woke up and he remembered all the lines, and he sat down with a pen and paper and started putting these lines down. He was called by a visitor. He attended to the visitor. He came back. He tried to resume composing the poem and found that he could not remember the rest of the lines. He could scribble a few more lines, then left the poem unfinished. So this is what we get in the note itself. And naturally, when the reader takes up the poem, the reader is under the influence of the poet's note and begins to feel, well, perhaps it is an unfinished poem. And perhaps some of the Well, perhaps the images which have been presented in the poem are all very haphazardly given. They are not sequential, they are not connected to each other. And as Professor Lewis has pointed out, that these images are brilliant but unconnected. Now, what is the poem about? Now we start our series of questions. What is the poem about? Is it a poem about Kubla Khan? Is it a poem about the pleasure dome? Is it a poem about the river Alf? Is it a poem about the Abyssinian maid, the damsel with the dulcimer? Is it a poem about the chasm, about the fountain, about the rocks or stones rather, not rocks, stones, vaulting forth through the chasm? What is it about? What is the poem about? Well, Coleridge has said that while he fell asleep, before he fell asleep, he was reading passages which dealt with Kubla Khan. And these passages he was reading from Puchaz's Pilgrimage. So that he has himself pointed out in his note. And the poem begins with a reference to Kubla Khan. Well, Kubla Khan, he ordained the pleasure dome to be built. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decreed. Now, the pleasure dome was to be built, and that was the decree by the monarch, the Mongol monarch, who ruled from 1206 to 1268. And that monarch decreed or ordained that a pleasure dome was to be built. And well, after that, we have rarely 3 more lines that refer to Kubla Khan. So, if we read the entire poem, we shall see that there are about 5 or 6 lines which are devoted to Kubla Khan, and about 4 or 5 lines which are devoted to the pleasure dome. So the question, as I raised, is it a poem about Kubla Khan? Who is Kubla Khan? Well, is he the Mongol monarch? Has he been presented in the play as the Mongol monarch? Or who is Kubla Khan? Well, is Kubla Khan simply a trope? Is Kubla Khan Coleridge himself? And the pleasure dome is aesthetic pleasure, the creation of art, the sublime form of art. So Kubla Khan is Coleridge himself, and he seeks to create a sublime work of art. And can we explain the river Alf and the meandering course of the river Alf as the delicate, the intricate process of creation? Now, well, there is a detailed description of the course of the river how the river Alf runs through caverns measureless to man. So, does that suggest the very delicate, the very complex, the very complicated process of creation, which cannot be described so easily? And through that long, arduous process of creation, finally, the brilliant, the sublime work of art is perhaps created, which is the pleasure dome. Can we think of the poem like this? No, the poem is not that easy. Well, if we say that, well, the poem can be explained so easily like that, perhaps it's not easy. So, what is it? Now, one thing, let us be clear about it. One thing is that a poem is not a philosophical teaching. A poet doesn't want to teach anything through his poem. The poem doesn't mean just a summary of something. We can summarize, we summarize a poem and, well, we understand the poem. That can never be. A poem means an experience, a poetic experience. And what the poet finally presents is the experience and the feeling and the imagination of the poet. So, we can never say that Kubla Khan can be analyzed or explained so easily as, well, we tried to do just now, that this Kubla Khan is Coleridge himself, and the pleasure dome is the poetic creation or the art of creation, the sublime art of creation, and the river Alf, the course of the river Alf, is the process of poetic creation. No, not that easy. Because how shall we describe the other details that we get here in the poem? Now, well, I'll just point out to you what Livingstone Lewis says. Lewis describes this poem as a poem with disjointed parts of brilliance. A poem with disjointed parts of brilliance. Now, what are the parts? Elf, chasm, wailing woman, demon lover, sunless sea, etc., etc., etc. And these parts, according to Lewis, though brilliant, but unconnected with one another. And what is the river Alf? Some critics have said that Alf reminds one of Alpha. Alpha, the first letter of Greek alphabet, Alpha. That means fundamental. So the fundamental, the beginning. So river Alf, the fundamental, the beginning. And in the poem we find that the river Alf is graphically described. Well, from its origin to the point where the sea falls into the ocean. The river takes a course, a meandering course through wood and dell. And it passes through caverns which are measureless to man. So, if we take the poem And if we try to read the poem without going into the intricacies of metaphors, allusions, and symbols, still we can have an understanding of the poem. Kubla Khan wanted his pleasure dome to be built. Where? Somewhere on the bank of the river Elf. Where is the river Elf? The river Elf originates from a chasm. Where was that chasm? On a hill, green hill, with cedar cover. And, well, how does the river emerge? Vaulting stones coming from out of the chasm. And with the vaulting stones, up came the river Elf. So that is the origin, that is the beginning. And then the river goes in a meandering course and falls into the sunless sea. Now, well, more details are given over there. That the place, holy and savage. And, well, under the waning moon, the wailing woman waits for her demon lover. Now, the question may be, well, why does Coleridge refer to the wailing woman, her demon lover, the waning moon, etc.? Why? What is the meaning of a place holy and savage? What is the meaning of the word savage here? All these questions may come, and they have been discussed and described and explained or interpreted in different ways by different critics. But, well, without going into the details of their discussions, well, savage, what's the meaning of the word savage? Well, if we try to decode the word savage as something which is unpolluted, which is uncorrupted. So a place which is away, remote from the thoroughfare of human beings, a remote place, beyond the domain of civilized world. In a way, that is a savage place. Savage is the opposite of civilized. So savage, it's not civilized, means it is not polluted. So unpolluted, therefore it is holy. Such a place. So, well, precisely we may suggest that the place would be a secluded place, an exclusive place, exclusive for the pleasure dome of Kubla Khan. And, well, the wailing woman and the demon lover. It may be, well, there are other explanations, we may definitely take them, but it may be that Coleridge deliberately uses these, deliberately brings in these images, the wailing woman and the demon lover, to put a supernatural note to it, to suggest the strangeness of the place, the romanticism, strangeness, and wonder. So, strangeness, perhaps Coleridge wants to incorporate strangeness by referring to wailing woman and demon lover. And once again, I just remind you that this is just one of the explanations, and this is an explanation which I give you, knowing fully well that there are other explanations given by other critics and writers. But, well, if we take up the poem and try to read the poem as a layman, we can definitely give this explanation. And Therefore, we can say that the first part of the poem can be explained as the locale, the description of the locale where the pleasure dome was to be made, and then, well, somewhere on the bank of the river Elf, and then the course of the river till it falls on the ocean. So, definitely, a poem is a poem. A poem will definitely contain images and certain twists and certain subtle suggestions. All these are provided by Coleridge through his incorporation of different things, like the waning moon, the wailing woman, the demon lover, the vaulting rocks, etc. But, well, keep them aside and try to understand it. It will be very easy. So, somewhere on the bank of the river, well, a place was selected by Kubla Khan, and this place was walled, encircled by walls. And where was this place? Definitely on the moon. Definitely on the hill. On the hill. On the hill. Well, the green hill with cedar cover. So that refers to the natural garden. So within the natural garden, that is forest, there will be a man-made or artificial garden, which will be precisely made by the men of Kubla Khan, and there the pleasure dome will be built. And the pleasure dome is explained, described by Kubla Khan as a miracle of rare device. A miracle of rare device. What is it? It's a miracle of rare device. A sunny pleasure dome with capes of ice. So, well, let us take it on its face value. So, the pleasure dome, in the material sense, it will be a work of great art. But the pleasure dome can be taken to represent a work of art. Any work of art can be explained, interpreted, or described as the pleasure dome. The pleasure is the pleasure of creativity. The pleasure is the pleasure of art. But what about the second part? In the second part, he talks about the damsel with her dulcimer, and she creates a music. So, well, the second part is almost a dream within the dream. And there, the damsel with her dulcimer creates a music. And the poet says, if he can create that music, he will be able to create the pleasure dome on the air. Now, well, there is a meaning in it, that the ultimate effect of all kinds of art is same. The work of art. What is a work of art? A work of art is definitely an imitation of nature. As Aristotle has said, a work of art is an imitation of nature. We imitate nature. Of course, we imitate nature, or well, Aristotle says that we imitate the actions of man. Man is also a part of nature. So, what is art? Art is imitation. It can be different kinds of imitation. So, sculpture, it is a kind of imitation. Poetry, it is a different kind of imitation. So is music. And what is the effect of art? Pleasure, joy, satisfaction, glorious feeling of blessedness. So the pleasure dome gives its effect in the mind in a similar way as music will have its effect on the human mind. So, in a way, a recreation of music will be the recreation of the pleasure dome. And towards the end, well, Coleridge refers to the honeydew and the milk of paradise. The honeydew and the milk of paradise may be explained as the great sublime creation of art, sublime creation of poetry. So earlier, Coleridge had referred to the young man with raised hair, with glowing eyes. And we know that Plato, in his Ion, described the poet in a similar manner. The poet is an inspired man. So, the inspired man with the glowing eyes and raised hair is creating something. Therefore, we can summarize our first lecture in this way, that Kubla Khan is a trope. Kubla Khan is actually Coleridge himself. And the pleasure dome is the work of art. The work of art is the result of an intricate process of creation, the course of the river Elf. And a work of art, any form, in any form, can give man a similar kind of a pleasure. The pleasure, therefore, there is no virtual difference between the pleasure dome and the music created by the Abyssinian men. Now, dear friends, dear students, I stop here because I wanted to make this lecture a brief one. So, if you feel that there is anything in the lecture, you may give your feedback to me, and in that case, I shall be taking up the same poem in a different way, discussing what different critiques have said and how far I agree with them or how far I do not agree with them. Thank you for today.